When Beatrice Caldwell staggered along FM 171 June morning, she was barely recognizable, gaunt to the bone, barefoot with shredded feet, and draped in nothing but tattered scraps of fabric that looked like they'd been dragged up from the earth. The woman who had vanished 2 years earlier in the Big Bend desert, the one everyone long believed was dead. But the most terrifying thing wasn't her ravaged appearance. The most terrifying thing was what she said about those 2 years. About the man who had held her captive, and about the people she insisted were still locked away somewhere out in the desert. Some names and details have been changed to protect identities and privacy. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss the latest cases. On the morning of October 14th, the red dirt parking lot at the Grapevine Hills trailhead on the edge of Big Bend National Park looked unusually cold and quiet as Beatrice Caldwell closed her SUV door for the last time before starting her hike. The 32-year-old woman, who lived in Austin and was used to the suffocating pace of office work, saw this 3-day backpacking trip as a crucial step toward reclaiming control after months of burnout, a space where she could decide her own breathing rhythm, her own walking pace, and her own moments of silence. According to other hikers present that morning, Beatrice looked more prepared than necessary for a moderate hike, with a brand new windbreaker, matching hiking outfit, and a specialized backpack whose value probably exceeded the total gear of everyone else combined. Still, her demeanor wasn't showy. She double-checked her bootlaces, adjusted her backpack straps, and marked her daily route on a paper map like a habit honed over years of hiking. Unlike the group hiking story in Ozark, Beatrice wasn't joining strangers. She chose Big Bend, a place vast enough to escape society, but familiar enough that she believed she could control everything. According to the plan recorded in the log at Panther Junction Visitor Center, she intended to head out from the trailhead around noon, reach Balanced Rock, take a few photos, and return to Chisos Basin Campground before sunset. The last witnesses to see Beatrice described her as cheerful and polite, showing no signs of anxiety or fatigue. A family from New Mexico even remembered her smiling and greeting them before stepping onto the rocky trail, her stride light but steady. All afternoon, golden sunlight stretched across the massive granite formations, and Beatrice's shadow fell across the hard-packed earth like a fragile line moving through an infinite sea of space. At 5:41 p.m., as the sun began to touch the horizon, Beatrice sent her brother a photo of Balanced Rock with a short but reassuring message. Done. Heading back. That was her last sign of life. When full darkness fell and the temperature dropped quickly into the chilly range, campers around Chisos Basin started noticing that Beatrice's tent site remained pitch dark, her camp stove unused, and her sleeping bag still packed away. 9 o'clock came and went, then 9:30. Her phone stayed out of service range. According to family, Beatrice not responding to messages for hours was unusual, especially on a trip where she had promised frequent check-ins. By 10 o'clock, rising worry prompted the family to contact the on-duty rangers at Chisos Basin directly. The rangers reviewed her registered itinerary, cross-checked it against sunset time, and confirmed that Beatrice should have returned long ago. No other hiker reported seeing her on the way back to the trailhead. The rangers officially logged her as missing a moment that marked the beginning of the greatest mystery Big Bend had ever seen, when a lone woman vanished completely into the vast, silent emptiness of the desert night. As the first lights spilled down the rocky slopes of Big Bend National Park, the ranger team assembled at the Grapevine Hills trailhead along with 2 K9 units and a drone operations crew, beginning the search at 6 a.m. With the primary focus on sweeping the route Beatrice Caldwell had planned to take back before sunset. The early morning air was cold and dry, a light wind blowing through the faded yellow yucca bushes, while the ground was covered in layers of fine sand mixed with small gravel, a terrain that readily holds footprints from anyone who has passed through, especially toward the end of the day, when overnight moisture hardens the soil and preserves tracks longer. However, along the entire length of the trail from the trailhead to the Balanced Rock area, there were no footprints matching the shoe size or gait described in the family's report, nor was there any scrap of trash, piece of paper, bottle cap, or personal item left along the path. even though the search team combed every uneven patch of ground, from small rock gullies leading down into valleys to the edges of creosote bushes growing right beside the trail. Everything remained eerily clean. The fact that a hiker could vanish completely in an area so prone to retaining traces like this prompted the rangers to note a clear level of anomaly, but protocol still required proceeding on the initial assumption that Beatrice might have slipped, gotten lost, or veered off the main trail to find a photo spot without reporting it. Around mid-morning, when one of the K9 team members spotted a small object caught under low grass near a seldom-used side branch, they bent down and picked up a pale blue fabric scrap, no bigger than half a palm, soft and thin to the touch, like the lining material commonly found in windbreakers. The scrap had no blood, no long tears, or any sign it had been violently yanked free during an accident that led the handler to log it simply as foreign debris that could have dropped from any hiker. They placed it in a miscellaneous evidence bag, marked it casually, and continued the search without assigning it high priority. The drones, meanwhile, systematically scanned each open area east of Grapevine Hills, flying parallel overlapping paths that covered Pine Canyon as well, where the network of deep, twisting canyons could easily trap a lost person with no way back. Yet the footage showed only empty stretches of ground, a few shadows of wildlife, and the dark outlines of boulders. No human figure, no flash of clothing color, no unusual movement, with no sudden terrain changes detected, such as fresh collapses of soil, newly rolled rocks, or trampled vegetation. The ranger team decided to expand the search southward, following the branches toward Juniper Canyon, where low brush, mixed with steep rocky slopes, could easily disorient someone unfamiliar with the terrain. There, they found countless footprints from previous hikers, overlapping trails that were difficult to analyze, but absolutely none matched the type of shoe Beatrice had listed on her trail registration. The harsh midday sun dried the ground so much that older tracks were already wind-erased, but even in the softest, flattest patches of soil, nothing proved she had ever passed through. By afternoon, Glen Springs Road, one of the most deserted gravel roads in Big Bend, became the final expanded search zone of the day, where the team hoped to find something small, like a hair tie, a bottle cap, or even a faint shoe skid mark. Despite combing every meter, the results remained empty. The report noted that for a solo hiker to disappear without leaving any trace was so rare it bordered on paradoxical in Big Bend's terrain, where fine sand readily captures even the smallest movements. The rangers were forced to issue a preliminary assessment based on what they had. No clear signs of foul play, no personal items left behind, no evidence of assault or struggle. Therefore, an accident involving getting lost or straying from the trail remained the most reasonable hypothesis. The search continued for 4 more days, spreading across side trails, low-lying depressions, and even areas along mountain flanks where strong winds typically erased tracks within hours. They deployed thermal equipment, swept lights from multiple angles at night to catch any reflections from metal or water bottles, but still found nothing. By the end of the 5th day, after more than 40 hours of continuous drone sweeps, 17 hours of K9 unit operations, and over 20 miles of trails scoured by rangers, the final conclusion was recorded in the report. No verifiable evidence showed Beatrice Caldwell remained in the area after the moment she sent the photo at 5:41 p.m., and the entire search zone exhibited absolute silence, with no disturbance whatsoever from footsteps or personal items belonging to her. 90 days had passed since Beatrice Caldwell was reported missing at Big Bend National Park, and the prolonged silence caused the case, which had once been treated as high priority in the early days, to gradually shift to cold case status at the Presidio County Sheriff's Office, a procedural move that also signaled there were no longer any viable leads to justify expanding the search area further. In the investigative summary compiled right before the file transfer, a temporary conclusion appeared in neutral but heavy wording. Insufficient evidence to determine criminal involvement. That statement rested on a string of stark data. No signs of a struggle, no recorded cries for help, no security camera footage from nearby rest stops, no indication that Beatrice had encountered a stranger before disappearing, and, most importantly, no item belonging to her, had been found within the search radius that had already been extended to include both Glen Springs Road and Juniper Canyon. For law enforcement, those numbers painted a picture of a disappearance that left no trace, rare but not unheard of in this vast desert region. However, for Beatrice's family, that conclusion was not only hurtful but completely at odds with everything they knew about her. They repeatedly emphasized during meetings with the Rangers that Beatrice was meticulous, always followed her documented itinerary, never deviated or left the trail without notifying someone, and certainly never let her phone stay out of contact for too long. Her history of previous solo hikes made this crystal clear. Every time she went hiking alone, she reported her departure time, expected return time, sent location photos, and always kept location sharing enabled for her brother, a pattern of behavior that made the family insist her vanishing without any sign was utterly inconsistent with her character. But the family's objections were not enough to alter the official assessment, because law enforcement found no foothold to shift the analysis toward a criminal angle. Over the course of 3 months, only 2 peripheral pieces of information came in through the tip line. One was an account from a hiker who claimed to have seen a silver SUV parked at the Grapevine Hills trailhead in the afternoon, roughly around the time Beatrice took the balanced rock photo. The other was a vague report that someone had heard an engine noise far off along Maverick Road that evening. However, both details were quickly dismissed from the list of credible leads. For the silver SUV, the witness's recalled time frame was off by nearly an hour from the confirmed window when Beatrice left the trailhead, and the Rangers noted that silver vehicles were so common in Big Bend that the detail held no investigative value. As for the engine sound supposedly heard that night, it was entirely unremarkable, since many campers used vehicles to move between campgrounds, and no one could pinpoint the sound's origin or connect it to the disappearance. On top of that, the absence of physical evidence made the case even harder to crack. The blue fabric scrap collected on the first day of the search, the only small item that might have suggested any connection, was mistakenly stored, never temporarily classified as evidence, and never sent to the lab for fiber analysis. In the storage system, it was filed together with other miscellaneous debris picked up along the trails, and since no one confirmed it belonged to Beatrice, it was not treated as something worth tracking. This inadvertently eliminated one of the few details that could have held value later, even though at the time the investigators only saw it as a wind-blown fragment of unknown origin. When the file moved to cold case status, volunteer search efforts also tapered off. No more calls came to the sheriff's office, reporting sightings of someone resembling Beatrice on the roads from Terlingua to Alpine. No additional items or traces turned up that hikers had found along the trails, and no phone signal ever pinged from her device after 5:41 p.m. on the day she vanished. With winter approaching, visitor numbers dwindled. Strong winds constantly swept through the narrow valleys, erasing old tracks, and the sporadic efforts of a few volunteer groups became almost futile. Silence spread across the desert like a blanket over all of Big Bend, and the longer it lasted, the more the case solidified into an immovable mystery. A woman who disappeared in broad daylight, with no direct witnesses, no footprints, no dropped belongings, no phone updates, no single anomaly to latch onto. The file was closed in that state, cold, lacking leads, directionless, and every question about what happened to Beatrice Caldwell seemed to sink deeper into a darkness no one knew how to reach. 2 years after Beatrice Caldwell's disappearance, at 8:30 a.m. in June, on the deserted stretch of FM 170, running along the Rio Grande riverbank, 2 Terlingua residents, a middle-aged couple who knew the roads like the back of their hands, after more than 2 decades, running shuttle services along this route, were driving their old pickup truck when they suddenly spotted a figure staggering along the shoulder, head bowed low as if the desert sun were pounding straight down on her, while she still forced one step after another. From a distance, the shape looked like nothing more than a hazy gray-brown shadow against the harsh white morning light. But as they drew closer, both immediately realized this wasn't an ordinary hiker, not someone out for exercise, but a woman in such utter exhaustion that it was impossible to understand how she was still managing to stay upright. When the truck came to a full stop beside her, they got out and called loudly, but the woman only turned her head slightly, revealing a face so gaunt that her cheekbones jutted sharply, lips cracked and dry, and eyes sunken deep like someone who had endured a long period of deprivation. The skin on her arms and shoulders was darkened from sunburn, but the patches beneath her collar were unnaturally pale, as though she had only recently emerged from a place deprived of light for a very long time. Her feet were bare, toes red and cracked open, caked with dirt mixed with rock fragments, and each step left scattered dry bloodstains on the pavement. Her clothing was barely intact. The t-shirt had faded to a pale gray, torn wide open at the shoulders and sides. The fabric frayed as though it had been constantly rubbed against rusty metal. Her long pants were ripped deeply from the knees down to the ankles, exposing a succession of bruises in various stages, some faded to pale yellow, others still deep red as though they had appeared just days earlier. Her hair was matted into hard clumps, tangled with dirt and bits of dry grass, as if it hadn't been combed or washed in many months. As they approached closer, she neither backed away nor showed any sign of defense. Instead, her body tilted to one side and then collapsed, and they had to rush forward to catch her so her head wouldn't hit the road. When they helped her stand, she opened her eyes halfway, swayed for a few seconds, then let out a weak, hoarse sound. When they asked if she needed help, she struggled to move her lips, and fragmented words began to spill out. One word about darkness, one about narrow, a broken phrase that sounded like low room, and then, as though all her remaining strength was funneled into saying just one thing, she uttered a sentence that left both of them frozen. "I'm not the only one." Her voice cracked, dry, and each word seemed torn from a throat long damaged. That statement didn't sound like the words of someone simply lost or exhausted. It carried the tone of a survivor who had just escaped something indescribable. As she began to tremble from dehydration and heat shock, her legs no longer able to support her body, they immediately understood that calling the police first wouldn't be fast enough. Any delay could cause her to die right there. Stranded on a remote road with the nearest medical facility more than 40 miles away, they decided to drive her straight to Big Bend Regional Medical Center in Alpine. The husband quickly spread a thin blanket in the truck bed to shield her already fragile skin from the desert wind, while the wife gently helped her lie down, talking to her constantly to keep her conscious, even if only for seconds at a time. The truck sped off, leaving behind the endless stretch of FM 170, while the woman lay shivering violently in the bed, her lips moving in broken sounds. Throughout the long drive, she sometimes opened her eyes to stare up at the pale blue sky, her gaze unfocused, then suddenly clutched the arm of the person caring for her, as though terrified the darkness behind her would catch up. At times, she blurted out short, almost unconscious words, "Machine running, under the ground, please don't." And each time, the wife had to reassure her that she was safe, even though they themselves couldn't comprehend what had driven her to such desperation. When the pickup reached the emergency entrance, the medical staff immediately recognized the severity of her condition. Skin with no elasticity from extreme dehydration, weak pulse, shallow breathing, and subnormal body temperature. But what made them pause longer were the deep indentations around her wrists and ankles, as though ropes or restraints had dug into the skin for so long they left dark purple grooves. On her arms, the pattern of bruises and abrasions was highly distinctive, not from falls or random impacts while lost, but from repeated rubbing against something rough and hard like rusted metal. When they lifted her shirt to check for other injuries, they noticed alternating patches of sunburned dark skin and ghostly pale areas, a classic sign of someone allowed outside only briefly and on a schedule, not someone wandering outdoors for days on end. Within minutes, the nurses called the attending physician and quickly noted in the initial report that the woman's condition matched only one description: a person held captive, likely in a confined, low-light space, for a very long time. When a staff member gently asked her name, she only moved her lips without sound. But when reassured that she was safe, her panicked eyes suddenly widened, and her hoarse voice came out again, this time clearer and more trembling. "I'm not the only one." That statement was immediately recorded in the hospital's initial file, and just minutes later, the duty staff called the Presidio County Sheriff's Office to report an emergency, with the assessment that this was very likely a victim of prolonged criminal confinement. When her identity was confirmed through matching physical characteristics, the hospital instantly realized that the emaciated woman lying on the gurney was Beatrice Caldwell, the woman who had vanished 2 years earlier. In that moment, the case that had seemed to fade into oblivion surged back with enormous weight, forcing law enforcement to reopen the file and confront the possibility that Beatrice's disappearance bore no resemblance to any of the hypotheses put forward in those first months. In the bright, white-lit emergency room of Big Bend Regional Medical Center, once the woman's vital signs had been temporarily stabilized, the attending physician decided to proceed with emergency identity confirmation protocol, starting by taking fingerprints from all 10 fingertips, which were so dry, cracked, and peeling that they had to be lightly moistened before pressing them onto the scanner. The data was transmitted through the federal system and cross-checked against Texas DMV records, taking only a few minutes for the result to appear. 100% match with the name Beatrice Caldwell. That confirmation not only left the medical team silent for several seconds, but also required them to file an urgent report, because the woman they were treating was the same person who had been missing for 2 full years in Big Bend without leaving any trace whatsoever. After fingerprint verification, they moved on to dental examination, comparing each feature against records from the dental clinic in Austin that Beatrice had visited. The familiar signs of an old filling, along with a small chip in her left premolar from a bicycle accident when she was 17 years old, further solidified the match. On her right shoulder, the doctor also noted a nearly 2-inch-long scar, a surgical scar from the time she dislocated her shoulder during a climbing trip in Colorado, matching perfectly with the medical history on file. All of these results erased any remaining doubt. The emaciated woman lying in the hospital bed was Beatrice. To ensure absolute certainty, a hair sample was clipped and immediately placed in a sealed evidence tube sent to a lab in El Paso capable of processing DNA in a short time frame. 6 hours later, when the results were sent back to the hospital system, the match figure appeared once more, delivering an indisputable confirmation of her identity. This news compelled the hospital to contact the family in Austin, and just a few hours later, the car carrying Beatrice's parents and brother was speeding toward Alpine in a mix of hope, fear, and bewilderment. When they arrived, the hospital hallway felt unusually heavy. The soft echo of shoes on tile floors, the steady hum of air conditioning, and at the end of the corridor, the room where the woman they had believed was lost forever lay breathing faintly. When the door opened, Beatrice's mother nearly collapsed on the spot at the sight of her daughter so thin that only the skeletal frame protruded beneath parched skin, hair matted into clumps, eyes half open but filled with underlying panic. She reached out with a trembling hand to touch her daughter's forehead, repeating over and over, "You're alive. You're alive," as though stopping would make the entire scene vanish. Her brother stood frozen for several seconds, unable to believe that the person who had once sent him the balanced rock photo 2 years earlier was now barely recognizable as a severely depleted body. Their father held his son's shoulders to keep him from falling, his own eyes red-rimmed as he watched her stir weakly, as if trying to acknowledge the family's presence. Under the effects of IV fluids and prolonged exhaustion, Beatrice was not yet able to speak coherently. But when a nurse gently called her name to test her reflexes, her half-closed eyes opened a little wider. Unable to form a full sentence, she only whispered a single word, faint but clear enough for the entire family to hear. Beatrice. That was all, but it was enough to shatter the paralysis in the room. The family burst into tears, while the medical team noted that she was capable of self-identification, even though she could not yet provide any further details. The doctors immediately updated the record to state that the victim had reappeared after 2 years in a condition showing signs of long-term captivity, with levels of physical and psychological depletion far exceeding those of a typical lost hiker. Based on the identity confirmation results, current physical state, and initial expert assessments, the Presidio County Sheriff's Office was forced to reclassify the case from missing under unknown circumstances to suspected abduction. For the first time in 2 years, the cause of Beatrice's disappearance was no longer viewed through the lens of accident or getting lost. All medical data and behavioral indicators pointed in one single direction. Her return was not only a shock to the family and the community, but also marked the moment when the disappearance was officially determined to be an abduction, opening up a flood of questions embedded in the desperate look in her eyes, questions that no one yet had answers to as she lay still in the hospital bed, her body reduced to faint breaths and eyes filled with an undecipherable haunting. Beatrice Caldwell's detailed medical record, compiled within the first 24 hours, clearly showed unmistakable signs on her body of prolonged captivity under conditions of severe light deprivation, malnutrition, and continuous physical trauma. As soon as basic blood work was performed, the doctors noted that her vitamin D level had dropped to the absolute lowest point on the clinical scale, a figure experts describe as impossible in an adult with normal sun exposure. Vitamin D can only reach such a low level when the body is completely isolated from natural sunlight for an extended period, typically spanning many months or even years. In addition, her bones showed clear signs of severe osteoporosis, with dramatically reduced bone density, proving prolonged lack of light and movement to the point that her body could no longer produce enough material to maintain bone structure. When she was taken for chest and abdominal X-rays, the doctors immediately noticed 2 ribs that had healed, but healed incorrectly. They protruded in an abnormal curve, as though they had been fractured by strong external force, and then mended without splinting or medical care. This indicated that these 2 injuries were not from a single incident, but likely the result of repeated cycles of abuse. An older fracture in the 7th rib on the left side was also discovered, a sign that she had endured a direct heavy blow to the chest or a fall in a confined space. Across Beatrice's unevenly tanned skin, the doctors found countless bruises in various stages of healing, pale yellow, purplish brown, deep red, forming a chaotic map of injuries sustained at different times. The bruises were concentrated on her arms, thighs, lower back, and both sides of her ribcage locations that typically receive the most direct force when a person is restrained and beaten. One doctor described in the clinical report that the time frame for the formation of these bruises spans from a few days to several months, indicating she had endured repeated episodes of violence throughout her captivity. But the most striking feature remained the indentations around her wrists and ankles. The grooves were not single but layered in multiple overlapping rings, some still darkened purple, others calloused, as though rope had cinched into the skin for so long that the epidermis was deeply damaged. The doctors concluded that these marks were caused by rope or high-tensile nylon cord, and the degree of injury showed she had been bound at multiple points, with varying degrees of tightness in each phase. In particular, both wrists showed signs of being pulled forward for extended periods, a posture commonly seen in victims confined in tight spaces who are forced to hunch or slump. Regarding her nutritional state, her lab values indicated near-terminal depletion. Her weight had fallen below 90 pounds despite her naturally healthy build. Body fat was virtually non-existent, blood sugar critically low, severe electrolyte imbalance, and serum protein reduced to the point that her body could no longer heal injuries on its own. This could only result from an extremely restricted diet, most likely consisting of dry bread, severely limited water, and absolutely no vegetables or adequate protein. Her body water level was dangerously low. Her skin had lost so much elasticity that a light press from a doctor left deep indentations. The hospital recorded that this level of dehydration would have pushed her into circulatory shock if rescue had been delayed by just a few more hours. One of the other critical findings came from analyzing the soil residue still clinging to her skin, hair, and under her fingernails. The mineral remnants contained illite, smectite, and a distinctive proportion of red clay that matched exactly with soil samples taken from the Terlingua Ranch Road area, where the geology features deep red hues and a clearly distinct mineral profile compared to Grapevine Hills or Chisos Basin. This indicated she had lived or been held in a location with similar ground, rather than wandering aimlessly in an open, natural environment. The fine layer of dust, settled in the crevices of her hair, suggested an environment lacking strong wind, implying it could have been a semi-enclosed space, such as a container, small room, or partially buried structure. When all the data was synthesized from X-rays, blood tests, skin injuries, degree of malnutrition, To mineral analysis, the medical team concluded that Beatrice had lived in long-term captivity for at least 18 to 24 months. And what made the entire medical team shudder as they signed the final summary report was not just the extent of the trauma, but the reality that her body had been only hours away from the edge of death. One doctor wrote plainly in the file, "Without timely discovery, the patient would not have survived to the end of the day." Beatrice Caldwell's survival was nothing short of a medical miracle, a body worn down to the point where only the thinnest thread of will kept life clinging on. Beatrice Caldwell's psychological profile was compiled as soon as she was alert enough to respond to her surroundings, and the initial notes quickly revealed that she was experiencing severe post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, manifested by hypervigilance so intense that her body remained constantly rigid, as though bracing for an invisible threat to appear at any moment. Every small sound in the room, from a nurse's footsteps to the soft click of a closing door, caused her to startle violently, eyes widening, pupils constricting as if facing the person who had held her captive. When the room lights were dimmed to help her rest, she immediately began trembling, breathing rapidly, and scanning the room frantically, demanding the lights be turned back on right away because darkness triggered a nameless terror. Her phobia of darkness stemmed not only from the prolonged lack of light during captivity, but also from the combination of enforced isolation, forced silence, and the sudden appearance of her captor whenever he opened the door without warning. Every time the hospital room light flickered due to a power glitch, she curled into herself, hands flying up to protect her head in a defensive reflex, just like someone who had been attacked repeatedly in a confined space. One of her strongest reactions occurred when she heard machinery running, whether it was the hum of the air conditioner, the water purifier, or even the faint vibration of medical equipment. She would instantly clamp her hands over her ears, her whole body shaking, breathing ragged, as though slammed back into memories of her place of captivity. The doctors in charge noted that the sound of a small generator was the most powerful trigger for her. Every time the hospital tested the backup power for a few seconds, she would plunge into extreme panic, her body twitching slightly, repeatedly murmuring phrases like, don't open the door," or "I don't want to go down there anymore," before bursting into uncontrollable sobs. Another incident recorded in the file occurred when a maintenance worker passed by her room, carrying a metal toolbox that clattered with its distinctive metallic rattle. In an instant, Beatrice slid off the bed onto the floor, hid behind the chair, covered her ears with both hands, and whispered, "Not today, please, not today," forcing the medical team to rush in, calm her, and help her back to bed. This reaction was quickly identified as a re-experiencing of memories from times when her captor entered her holding place carrying tools or metal objects. The presence of unfamiliar men also produced a clear psychological impact. When a male doctor entered the room to examine her wounds, Beatrice immediately pulled her arms tight against her body, turned her face to the wall, and refused to respond to any questions. Her tension was so severe that a female nurse had to take over for the examination to continue. The fact that avoidance responses appeared only in the presence of men suggested her captor was male, and that prolonged abuse had imprinted itself onto her survival reflexes. In many fragmented conversations with nurses, her disjointed statements further proved the heavy psychological haunting that persisted. She often whispered phrases like, "Don't let him know I escaped. He always hears. Don't turn off the light. He'll come in." Statements that the nurses recorded almost unchanged over many days, proving her mind remained trapped in a hunted state, even in safety. On another occasion, when the sound of a medical cart with a misaligned wheel squeaked rhythmically down the hallway outside, she immediately curled up, eyes wide, staring toward the door, murmuring, "He found me," until the noise stopped. The hospital's psychology team quickly determined that auditory stimuli related to motors, electrical hums, or metal clanging all triggered flashbacks, intrusive re-experiencings that made the victim feel as though she were back in captivity. They warned investigators that any interview must be time-limited, the space must have controlled lighting, stable sound levels, and absolutely no generator noise near her room. When an investigator tried questioning her one morning, her voice was very soft, halting, barely able to form complete sentences. She managed a few words. Then, as though pulled back into a nightmare, her eyes went vacant. Her body shook in spasms. The doctor immediately halted the interview, noting that even slightly improper triggering of memories could plunge her into prolonged panic and severely impair recovery. In numerous internal reports, experts described Beatrice's mental state as matching cases of prolonged captivity and torture, abnormal defensive responses, total fear of darkness, sound obsessions, extreme hypervigilance, panic around men, continuously disrupted sleep, and a 24/7 sense of being watched even while in the hospital. These descriptions came with a grave assessment. She still lived as though her captor had only temporarily stepped out of sight and could return at any moment. At night, nurses recorded multiple episodes where she jolted awake, gasping, scanned the room with wild eyes, then clutched the bed rail for support, repeating, "He doesn't know I escaped. He doesn't know. He doesn't know," like a mantra to keep herself calm. All these signs showed that while her body had left captivity, her mind had not. The fear lay just beneath the surface of consciousness, ready to surge at any sound, shadow, or approaching figure that echoed the man who had tormented her for 24 months. Despite years of experience with PTSD cases, the experts were still shocked by the depth of Beatrice Caldwell's trauma, a psyche pushed to its absolute limit, leaving behind primal reflexes seen only in survivors who spent too long in darkness, stripped of any sense of safety until every moment became preparation for pain. In the first interview session, with both the psychologist and the investigator present to ensure Beatrice Caldwell's mental stability, she sat hunched on the bed, hands gripping the edge of the blanket so tightly it seemed like the only thing anchoring her to reality. Her voice was still weak, each syllable forced out with visible effort. But when asked about the man who had held her captive, her eyes changed abruptly, not with anger, but with an instinctive wariness, as though merely mentioning him was enough to drag her back into the dark space that had haunted her for 24 months. She described the perpetrator as a man around 45 to 50 years old, white skin, not particularly tall but solidly built, broad shoulders typical of manual labor. His face was always covered in a scruffy beard that looked like it was never properly groomed, and his voice carried the distinctive drawl of West Texas elongated at the end of sentences, hard, dry, sounding like gravel crunching underfoot. That very timbre made her shudder every time he spoke, because beneath his voice lurked an inexplicable resentment, as though he were addressing someone else entirely, not her. But it was his eyes that haunted her the most. Beatrice closed her own eyes as she tried to describe them. Cold, cloudy, like looking right through me. Not at me, but at someone else. The investigator asked her to explain more specifically, and she slowly recounted that every time he entered her place of captivity, he didn't look at her as a victim or a person, but with eyes full of irrational hatred, a grudge that didn't stem from anything she had done. That gaze made her understand immediately that he hadn't taken her for money, nor for desire, but for something deeper, something that had existed inside him long before he ever met her. In the rare moments he muttered to himself, Beatrice heard phrases that chilled her. Just like her. Exactly like her. He never explained who her was, but the bitterness in his voice was unmistakable, as though the image of that woman was an open wound that had never healed. She realized this when he stood just outside the door, the light from the crack spilling in only enough for her to hear his heavy breathing. He whispered fragmented sentences, sometimes louder, enough for her to understand that her very existence stirred up some memory he couldn't bear. Whenever she tried to resist or instinctively fought to free herself from restraints, he immediately changed his tone, not calling her by name anymore, but using a word that froze her entire body. Mother. Not the tone of someone seeking comfort, but a voice overflowing with hatred, the timbre of a wounded child transformed into the voice of a grown man carrying unhealed rage. He called me mother every time he hit me, Beatrice said, her voice trembling violently, hands pulled tight against her chest, breathing rapid as though struggling to suppress the memories rising up. The investigator wrote quickly but glanced at the psychologist with an understanding look that this statement opened an entirely new line of analysis. When asked why she thought she resembled his mother, Beatrice didn't answer right away. It took her a long moment before she could continue, because every mention of his eyes or voice visibly triggered panic. She explained that one time he entered the holding space without turning on the light. She saw him stand silently watching her for a very long time and mutter, "You can't get away." She never got away. She didn't understand the meaning at the time, but after many months, she realized he wasn't seeing her as a separate individual. In his mind, she wasn't Beatrice Caldwell. She was a stand-in for another woman, the one who had fueled his hatred for years. When the investigator asked for more details about his appearance, her voice broke into fragments, hair mixed gray and brown, cut unevenly as though he did it himself, the constant smell of motor oil and metal tools clinging to him, rough hands with calluses running from the palm to the thumb, typical of someone who used heavy vibrating tools for long periods. Occasionally he coughed like someone with irritated lungs from working in dusty or polluted environments. The investigator noted every detail, including that he usually wore hard-soled boots that made heavy footsteps, so she always knew when he was approaching without needing to look. When the session ended, the psychologist assessed that Beatrice's descriptions reflected a consistent psychological profile. The perpetrator was highly likely to carry childhood trauma directly related to his mother or a female caregiver who had abused him, and abducting Beatrice was a symbolic act meant to recreate that hated relationship so he could unleash all his pent-up resentment onto her. The investigator recorded in the report that the details Beatrice provided were not disjointed but consistent, from his eyes, his voice, his punitive behavior, to the way he addressed her. Initial conclusions indicated the perpetrator could be someone living in the West Texas area, familiar with mechanical labor or generator repair, currently in his mid-40s to 50s. More importantly, the fact that he saw her as someone else confirmed that his motive was not random, but stemmed from a deep psychological wound formed in childhood, where the figure of his mother or a woman in a similar role had become the source of both his hatred and the violent behavior Beatrice had endured. In the next interview session, Beatrice Caldwell tried to recall the moment of her abduction. Each fragment of memory, like broken shards of glass mixed with panic, yet sharp enough to cut into her present awareness. She recounted that when she left the Grapevine Hills trailhead in the sunny afternoon, she had noticed a silver SUV parked a few dozen meters away, pulled off toward the gravel shoulder where hikers usually didn't park. At the time, the sight didn't draw much attention from her because the area had quite a few SUVs in neutral colors, and she simply assumed the driver was taking photos or resting somewhere nearby. She walked past, feeling the heat rising from the pavement through her shoes, but she felt absolutely no threat whatsoever. A short distance later, she heard a light crunch of gravel behind her, then hurried but not aggressive footsteps. A man, the one she later knew was her captor, approached with a feigned awkwardness, asking if she knew the way to the Study Butte area because he said he was lost and his phone map wouldn't load. His West Texas accent and non-threatening demeanor kept her from being on guard, and since she was used to helping others while hiking, she stopped, opened the paper map in her backpack, and pointed out the nearest route for him. As she bent down to unfold the map, Beatrice remembered the sunlight suddenly being blocked for a very brief moment, just long enough for him to close in behind her. She didn't have time to turn around. A large, rough hand clamped a cloth over her mouth and nose. The sharp, sweet, icy chemical smell flooded her sinuses, making her head spin within seconds. She tried to push him away, but her limbs lost strength so quickly that she couldn't stay upright. The last thing she remembered was the ground tilting sideways, the late afternoon sunlight stretching into a blurred streak before everything went black. When she woke up, everything around her had turned into thick, impenetrable darkness. No natural light, no windows, no sound of wind or hikers' footsteps, only the cold smell of metal mixed with damp earth and motor oil, which immediately told her she was in a completely man-made space. She described rough, ice-cold metal walls with the structure of a shipping container, but the echo when she touched them suggested it wasn't sitting on the surface, it was partially buried. The floor was slightly slanted, and when she reached out in the dark, her fingers brushed dry, fine dust, a sensation she grew familiar with after many months locked there. Beatrice said he appeared for the first time about a few hours after she woke. The metal door opened with a long screech. The beam from a handheld flashlight swept through the narrow space and blinded her, and right away she heard his icy voice. No talking unless you're spoken to. When she reflexively cried out for help, he immediately kicked the metal wall hard, the sound booming like thunder in the confined space, silencing her out of sheer terror. He laid out a whole list of rules right in that first encounter. She had to call him sir. She wasn't allowed to stand when he entered unless permitted. She couldn't touch the door. She couldn't ask any questions. And she absolutely could not cry out loud. He spoke like he was reciting something he'd memorized by heart, Beatrice said. No emotion. But there was something like hatred. Every time she broke a rule, even unintentionally, he punished her, turning off all the lights for hours, reducing her already meager water ration, or binding her wrists so tightly to a metal bar near the floor that she couldn't move. Throughout her captivity, she gradually realized he knew far too much about her habits and schedule during the trip. He knew exactly when she left the trailhead, knew she often stopped to take photos whenever she saw beautiful terrain, knew she liked hiking alone to find silence details that could only have been gathered if he had been watching her beforehand, not the random act of someone who stumbled upon a victim by chance. She recounted that in one rare moment, when he thought she was asleep, he muttered under his breath, "I've been watching you for weeks. You didn't know, did you?" That statement, even though it was half mumbled, was enough for her to understand that his approach at Grapevine Hills wasn't impulsive. It was a calculated step in a plan set long before. When the investigator asked for more evidence of his surveillance, Beatrice recalled that in the final week before the trip, she had felt a vehicle following her on the drive from Austin to Big Bend, but since it was a popular tourist route with lots of cars, she didn't pay attention. She also remembered seeing a figure standing far off near the Chisos Basin parking lot on the morning she set out. But she thought it was just another hiker. Those scattered memories, when pieced together, showed that the perpetrator had trailed her for days, learned her routines, and identified the perfect moment to strike without drawing notice. Her account prompted the investigator to immediately note that every action of his was deliberate, premeditated, and not the result of an unexpected opportunity. "He didn't choose me because I was there," Beatrice said in a voice as thin as her remaining breath. "He chose me because I looked like someone, and he waited for the right moment." Just one sentence. But it was enough to plunge the entire room into silence, because it confirmed her deepest fear. He hadn't taken her because of situational convenience. He had reason also to see the aesthetic to the place. He had nothing won. This is a none. Also is no. He hadn't taken her because of situational convenience, but because of a reason that had existed in his mind long before a reason only he knew, and for which she was forced to become the victim. In the third interview session, when Beatrice Caldwell was asked to describe in detail what had happened throughout her captivity, the room grew so quiet that the scratch of the investigator's pen on paper was clearly audible. Beatrice sat leaning slightly to one side, her hands clasped tightly together, as though letting go would allow the flood of memories to rush in and drown her right there. She explained that the holding space wasn't just a dark, narrow container with almost no air, but a distorted replica of the basement from childhood that the perpetrator had mentioned many times during his moments of loss of control. The container was partially buried underground, with a ceiling so low she couldn't stand fully upright, sealed metal walls, no windows, only a small slit near the ceiling to allow a trickle of heavy, musty, earth-smelling air. Over many months, that container served not only as a prison but as the stage for punishment rituals he forced her to follow, as a way to recreate the time his mother had locked him in the basement years ago. Beatrice recounted that every time he opened the container door, the flashlight beam swept through and blinded her, and as soon as she managed to steady her breathing, he would command in a cold, dry voice, "Say it." If she didn't respond immediately, he would slam hard against the metal wall, the sound booming so loudly it threw her off balance. She was forced to repeat the sentence he demanded, one that still made her tremble, even now when she thought of it. "I'm sorry, son." Not an apology for anything specific, but the exact phrase he made her say in the tone of a mother begging forgiveness from her son. Only when she repeated it loudly enough and with the intonation he imagined would he give her a small portion of food or a tiny bottle of water. This coercion stretched over dozens of weeks, nearly erasing her sense of her own real voice. He structured her entire existence around his obsession. To eat, she had to play the role of mother. To sleep, she had to wait for his permission. To breathe peacefully, she had to maintain absolute silence whenever she heard his footsteps approaching. Sleep, the one thing that could give her a few hours of escape from reality, was deliberately taken from her. In the container, a small fan mounted in the corner ran a constant white noise day and night. But every time she began to drift off, he would switch the fan to a high vibration setting, turning the steady hum into piercing, grating sounds like metal scraping against metal. The sudden change jolted her awake in panic, unable to distinguish what was real from the painful memories. "He knew I was afraid of machinery sounds," she whispered, "and he used it as a tool to keep me awake." Every time she resisted even just trying to stand when he entered, or turning her face away when forced to say the apology, he punished her immediately. The weapon he used wasn't a club or kicks, but an old piece of electrical cord as thick as a thumb, its rubber sheath worn and cracked over time. When he swung it down, the cord sliced through the air with a sharp whip-like sound, each strike leaving a long, bright red welt on her skin that later turned purple-green. Once, when she resisted strongly and tried to push him away as he grabbed her arm, he flew into a rage, lashing her ribs repeatedly with the cord until she heard a small crack, then felt a searing pain spread through her chest that made breathing impossible. That was the time she suffered the broken rib, the injury that still showed signs of improper healing when she was admitted to the hospital. But what terrified her most wasn't the beatings, it was the moments when he sat near the container door and began to talk not to her, but as though speaking to himself about his childhood. She heard him say that his mother never loved him, that she locked him up when he did something wrong, that she beat him with electrical cord, humiliated him, and called him useless. Once he said in a low, resentful voice, "She always made me apologize. Always made me say that exact sentence." Then he stared at her, his cloudy eyes looking through time itself, and forced her to repeat the phrase he had once said to the woman who had destroyed his childhood. Beatrice explained that whenever he entered with a hardened tone and called her mother, she knew punishment was coming. Sometimes he made her kneel in the dark for hours. Sometimes he forced her into a crouched position in the corner of the container, hands behind her head like a punished child. His entire sequence of actions, from controlling her food portions, sleep, light, speech, to making her embody the mother role, formed a repeating pattern, like a ritual he used to reenact and punish his own past. When the investigator asked Beatrice to describe how she felt during each ritual, she said she never felt he was beating her to cause physical pain, but because he wanted her to become the figure he hated, the one who had inflicted the deepest pain on him as a child. This made every punishment not just violence, but a twisted veneration from an obsessed mind. He punished her not for who she was, but for who she represented. Beatrice's testimony, when analyzed, revealed clear ritualistic behavior in his actions. The captivity setting, recreating the basement, the forced repeated phrase as a ritual, the use of white noise to control sleep, punishments tied to the role he imposed on her. None of it was impulsive or instinctual. It was the structured repetition of someone trying to regain control over memories that once left him powerless in childhood. Beatrice closed the session with a sentence that sent chills through both the investigator and the psychologist. "He didn't look at me like a living person. He looked at me like the ghost of her, and he would never stop until he believed I knew what I was supposed to be afraid of." In the final interview session about the moment of her escape, Beatrice Caldwell sat silently for a very long time before beginning to speak, as though her mind had to trace backward through the thick darkness of 24 months to reach the single moment when hope appeared. She remembered very clearly that day the wind shifted unusually. For many hours straight, the container shook lightly, as though someone was pushing it from outside. But she knew it wasn't him, because his familiar footsteps didn't sound. Then suddenly, a choked, failing sound like the final breath of a strangled animal came from above the container. It was the generator he used to power the fan, the rechargeable flashlight, and the makeshift electric lock system on the outside. A fierce sandstorm swept through the desert region, forcing fine dust deep into the machine's crevices. The engine's hum slowed, stuttered, then died completely. When that familiar noise vanished, the container's space became terrifyingly silent. But in that very instant, she heard a tiny click from the door area, the sound of metal losing its locking force. In the darkness, Beatrice felt her way to the edge of the door, trembling as she lightly touched the cold metal rim, and realized the electronic lock had stopped working due to the power failure. The door didn't swing open wide, but it jammed ajar by about 2 inches, an opening just wide enough for a finger to slip through. It wasn't an escape route, but for the first time in 24 months, she felt the solid structure around her could be broken. Beatrice recounted that for many weeks prior, she had hidden a metal spoon under the thin mat spread right against the floor. That spoon had originally been one of the few eating utensils he gave her, but she had deliberately worn down the head by scraping it against the wall edge to make it thinner, flatter, and harder. She called it her only chance, even though at the time she didn't yet know what she would use it for. When the sandstorm rocked the container, the mat shifted, and she felt for the spoon by touch in the dark. She knew if she missed this moment, he would return, and the opportunity would be gone forever. Beatrice wedged the spoon tip into the small gap and tried to pry the door hinge. The metal screeched in short bursts, echoing in the confined space and making her fear he would hear it, even though she sensed he was very far away, perhaps taking shelter from the storm or trying to fix the generator. Each pry sent sharp pain through her hands, her wrists tearing open old wounds from being pulled apart. But she didn't stop. A long time later, she didn't remember how many minutes, maybe dozens, maybe an entire hour. One side of the hinge popped free with a soft snap. She held her breath, then pushed with all her strength against the remaining edge of the door. The container shook hard. Sand poured down from the ceiling slit, and finally the door shifted enough to create an opening the width of a notebook. Not enough for an adult to walk through, but enough for her with a body wasted down to skin and bones to crawl out. Beatrice turned sideways, took a deep breath, then forced her body through the gap. The metal edges cut into the skin at her shoulders and hips, but she kept pulling until her entire body tumbled out onto the ground outside. When she hit the earth, the first thing she noticed was the smell. The deep, rich, red earth scent of the soil north of Terlingua Creek. A smell she had once known well when traveling in this area. The damp mineral scent, mixed with smectite clay, was completely different from the sandy soil smell at Grapevine Hills, telling her she was no longer near the place where she had vanished. There was no time for long orientation. Beatrice looked up at the dust-obscured sky through the sandstorm, searching for the sun's hidden position. She used instinct and memories of the terrain to head west toward FM 170 running along the Rio Grande riverbank. Every step felt like it was tearing the soles of her feet apart because she had no shoes. Only bare feet hardened by calluses, yet cracked open and sliced by hot dirt and sharp rock fragments. She knew the South had many razor-sharp rock areas, especially along the rocky slopes toward Black Gap Wildlife Management Area. So she avoided that direction completely because her feet couldn't have endured it. Instead, she followed a natural wash, a narrow drainage channel heading toward the Lajitas area, where the terrain was softer and had fewer sharp rocks. She crawled when she couldn't stand, dragged herself when her legs gave out, and when she saw the shadow of a creosote bush, she collapsed into it to escape the burning sun. Beatrice said she didn't remember how many times she rested, only that each time she opened her eyes, the sun was in a different position, proving she had drifted through many hours without realizing it. When night fell, the temperature dropped sharply, the wind cutting into her skin like needles. But the darkness also shielded her from the scorching sun. She felt her way along the ground with her hands, listening to the wind, the insects, and smelling the earth to adjust her direction. After many hours of staggering, when she was almost completely exhausted, she saw the dark, straight line of a paved state road, artificial, unlike anything in the desert. It was the road leading from Lajitas toward Terlingua. She forced herself a few dozen more steps before her legs finally gave out. The next morning, 2 Terlingua residents driving along FM 170 spotted her gaunt to the bone, hair matted into hard clumps, skin blotched with sunburn, and half-open eyes no longer able to focus. When they lifted her into the truck bed, her body was so light It felt like nothing more than a faintly trembling skeletal frame with each breath. Beatrice said she only vaguely remembered the sensation of being carried, someone's voice calling her name, even though she didn't understand how they knew it, and right after that, everything turned white. She collapsed completely, breathing in ragged gasps, while the two strangers sped toward the hospital at full throttle, unaware that they had just found the victim of a prolonged captivity who had escaped through one of the most desperate journeys a human being could endure. As soon as Beatrice Caldwell was strong enough to provide a stable sequence of statements about the space where she had been held, the federal investigative team, in coordination with FBI geological experts, immediately began cross-referencing the details in her account, with soil samples collected from her hair, skin, and tattered clothing. The mineral analysis results showed that the dust contained a rare mixture of decomposed basalt blended with characteristic red illite and smectite clays, a combination that only appears in the area northeast of Terlingua Ranch Road. Combined with her repeated descriptions of the damp earth smell, the coldness of the rock layer, and the slanted structure of the container floor, the FBI narrowed the new search radius to just a few square miles, a far smaller area than the vast expanse of Big Bend. Specialized drone teams were deployed, flying low over the terrain above Terlingua Ranch Road, where the geology is easily eroded by wind, making any artificial subsurface changes leave subtle traces difficult for the naked eye to detect. After only 2 flights, the drones captured images of an area with abnormal compaction, an unusually even surface, few animal tracks, deeply compressed gravel, and a darker soil tone than the surrounding region. These features led the analysis team to suspect the spot had been excavated and then refilled, typical of sites where large metal objects like containers or tanks are buried. Once the precise point of interest was pinpointed, investigators deployed thermal cameras at dusk, when the temperature difference between natural soil and a buried metal object is most visible. The captured images displayed a rectangular dark shadow against the brighter ground, clearly indicating a heat-absorbing object buried about 1 meter underground. The object's dimensions matched almost exactly Beatrice's description of the container where she was held: narrow, long, and partially submerged beneath the surface. Thermal data also revealed small, round, consistent hotspots around the object, consistent with her account of the perpetrator placing mini-generators outside, causing the ground to retain heat over long periods. At this point, investigators began comparing the escape route Beatrice described with detailed topographic maps. The landmarks she mentioned, the natural drainage wash, the red clay smell, the wind shifting southwest, the sun filtering through the sandstorm dust, all aligned precisely with coordinates near Terlingua Creek and the road segment heading toward FM 170. Even though her body was so depleted at the time that she lost consciousness in waves, the fact that she still correctly oriented herself westward, using the faint sun through the sandstorm, showed that her memories were not scrambled like those of many other victims. Every detail matched the actual terrain so closely that the investigative team had to note her statements as having very high reliability. When ground teams arrived at the site, guided by the drone data, they discovered shallow tire impressions on the hard-packed soil to the north, near the thermal anomaly. The tire tracks were faint because desert winds had already blurred most of them, but the remaining tread pattern was sufficient to identify it as BF Goodrich All-Terrain T, AKO2, a line of tires designed for rough terrain, rarely used by casual tourists, and typical of locals working in desert or granitic rock conditions. Finding this tire type not only strengthened the investigation into the suspect's vehicle but also matched Beatrice's indirect description of the gravel crunching sound when he approached the container. Based on the geological pattern analysis and soil compaction traces, the team determined the container had been partially buried to reduce echo and conceal it from distant observation, a detail Beatrice had accurately described when she said the room felt tilted to one side and was always colder than the Citivity. Rest. Soil samples excavated around the container matched perfectly with the residue in her hair, including glossy black basalt grains and red clay dust that do not appear at Grapevine Hills, further proving she had been taken to a location farther from where she disappeared. When the forensic team expanded the search radius to 1 mile around the container, they confirmed that Beatrice's movement path aligned completely with the real terrain. The dry washes heading toward Legita's, the soft sandy areas to the north, and the sharp rock zones to the south all matched her escape choices. Her avoidance of the sharp rock areas was entirely logical, as that region features extremely thin, razor-like shale formations that would have been lethal to bare feet. Choosing to follow the natural drainage wash was a decision only someone with a sliver of remaining awareness could have made in her near-collapse state. From start to finish in the tracing process, investigators noted that Beatrice's account contained no geographical or temporal contradictions. Every detail from the container's tilt, the motor oil smell, the generator noise, the red clay mineral scent, to the wind direction, and the route she chose to escape was verified by geological evidence, drone imagery, thermal camera footage, and on-site surveys. The FBI officially recorded in the report that the degree of correspondence between her statements and field data achieved an unusually high level of consistency, confirming that what Beatrice described was not merely painful memory, but a precise truth about a carefully prepared holding site engineered by the perpetrator. When the investigative team began excavating the area identified by the thermal camera as having a heat-absorbing object buried underground, the red clay soil was dug up to reveal the rusted metal roof of a partially buried container, exactly as Beatrice Caldwell had described the space where she was held for 24 months. The container was about 2.5 meters long, less than 1.5 meters wide, with a pitted surface showing heavy oxidation that indicated it had been underground for a very long time. When technicians used hydraulic equipment to lift the container out of the ground, the front door became visible, hinges misaligned and bent, with an electronic lock still attached to the frame but burned out. The plastic casing melted and fused into lumps. Clear evidence that the sandstorm that killed the generator had also overloaded and disabled the locking system. This matched perfectly with her account of the moment she pried the door open to escape. When the container door was opened, a suffocating wave of musty dampness, human body odor, and cold metal smell rushed out at once, forcing the investigators to don respirators before entering. High-powered lights swept through the narrow space, revealing an old mat covering the floor, worn and torn and thick with red Terlingua Ranch dirt. The mat still showed a distinct worn spot from repeated rubbing at one point in the middle of the floor, consistent with Beatrice's description of hiding a metal spoon under the mat to sharpen it and use it to pry the door hinge. Near the wall edge lay an old black nylon restraint cord, one end still knotted, the other frayed from heavy friction. Skin cell residue on the cord was collected on site. In one corner of the container, a 5-gallon plastic water jug lay tipped over, its body drilled with multiple small, evenly spaced holes that allowed controlled dripping deliberate modifications to restrict the victim's water intake to whatever level the perpetrator desired. These were not natural leaks but intentional perforations made with a handheld drill or sharp tool, with circular scratch marks on the surface proving the jug had been repeatedly adjusted. Not far away, the team found an old mini-electric fan, its blades and outer frame completely coated in dust. Its design matched exactly Beatrice's description of the fan that produced constant white noise and kept her awake for months. Next to the fan was a small, broken generator, its interior still showing blackened burned wires, confirming the power failure during the sandstorm as the cause of the container losing electricity. These two items, the mini fan and the generator, became powerful physical evidence, confirming the accuracy of her statements, as they appeared in precisely the locations she had described. At the far end of the container, under a rolled-up section of the mat, investigators discovered a small, unlocked metal box containing a few of the perpetrator's personal items: a worn multi-tool knife, a piece of copper wire once used for binding, and most importantly, a worn-edged paper notebook with a dust-covered red clay-stained cover. When opened, the first pages were filled with scribbled, heavily crossed out, and rewritten lines, mostly repeating the words mother and punishment. Other pages contained fragmented sentences like, "She never listened, make her say it," and "same eyes, same voice," showing the perpetrator used the notebook as an outlet to vent rage or reenact childhood obsessions. The notebook became crucial evidence, proving the abuse followed a ritualistic, repeating pattern, rather than impulsive acts. When the forensic team swabbed the container surfaces for DNA, they found multiple significant traces. Samples from the walls, mat, and restraint cord all contained DNA matching Beatrice Caldwell, confirming her long-term presence in the container. However, the more shocking discovery was the presence of DNA from two other women in the collected samples, both unidentified at the time of initial analysis. Their DNA appeared on the restraint cord, on the water jug surface, and in dried skin cells still clinging to the wall edges, providing irrefutable proof that Beatrice was not the only person ever held in this structure, and that the container had been used repeatedly for multiple victims. This eliminated any possibility that the container was only a temporary holding site. While further examining the surrounding area, investigators noted additional signs that the perpetrator had long-term plans for operating this holding point. Old tire tracks were deeply impressed into the hard soil leading to the container, many matching the BF Goodrich ATKO 2 tread pattern previously identified from terrain data. Scattered pieces of electrical wire, screws, and empty spare parts boxes were found just a few meters from the container, proving the perpetrator regularly maintained, adjusted, and reinforced the structure for prolonged use. The area around the container showed almost no wildlife tracks, indicating the perpetrator had created paths or cleared zones to minimize natural intrusion, further demonstrating meticulous planning. On-site experts noted that partially burying the container not only reduced noise, but also concealed it from distant view, while keeping the interior temperature consistently low, causing the victim to lose all sense of time, a feature that perfectly matched Beatrice's description of day and night blending together. All the collected evidence showed the container was not a hastily constructed site, but a pre-prepared, maintained, and repeatedly used holding location, proving the perpetrator did not act impulsively but invested clear planning and resources into operating a site for long-term captivity. When combined with Beatrice's testimony, the crime scene became undeniable proof. Every detail she described appeared exactly in this container, from the fan noise, the earth smell, the cramped dimensions, to the items used for punishment. The partially buried container, along with everything inside it, was not just physical evidence, but a brutal reenactment of the 2 years of hell Beatrice endured, and every trace showed what happened inside was entirely deliberate, cold, and prepared over a long period. When the investigative team cross-referenced the crime scene evidence with civilian records and potential criminal profiles, one name stood out above all. Russell Mercer, 47 years old, a resident of the town of Marfa, who had worked as a generator repair technician for nearly 2 decades, a detail that matched in a chilling way with the operation of the partially buried container and the small generator system found at the Palin scene. Mercer had a history of working on remote job sites, from rock quarries to temporary desert housing camps, where generators were the only power source, and operators had to know how to repair and maintain them even under harsh conditions. This was precisely the skill set required to sustain the container where Beatrice was held. A system that demanded handling power sources, controlling temperature, and keeping machinery running quietly but continuously. As investigators dug deeper into Mercer's past, CPS records from 1987 revealed a much darker chapter. Mercer had suffered severe abuse from his mother throughout his childhood. The reports described a mother who frequently used violence, beating and locking her son in the basement for hours, sometimes days at a time, as a form of punishment to teach him a lesson he'd never forget. The reports also noted that Mercer was only 9 years old at the time. Throughout one school year, he was found with numerous bruises on his arms, back, and wrists. A social worker noted that the boy was unusually compliant, avoided eye contact with adults, and repeatedly said he was at fault even when no one blamed him. Later documents recorded the child blurting out during an interview, "I'm sorry, I'll say it, but please don't lock me up anymore." A horrifying match with the exact phrase he forced Beatrice to repeat during her captivity. "I'm sorry, son." All of this led investigators to recognize a direct link between the childhood abuse pattern and the punishment model Mercer imposed on his victim. From initial information about the suspect vehicle, Authorities confirmed that Mercer owned a silver SUV, a 2006 Toyota 4Runner, that matched the description from the witness who saw one at Grapevine Hills trailhead on the day Beatrice disappeared. His vehicle was also fitted with BF Goodrich all-terrain AKO2 tires, the rare type previously identified at the container site. When investigators checked vehicle registration records, they noted that the SUV had appeared multiple times in the Terlingua Ranch area, corroborated by statements from several local residents. One man who lived near the entrance to Terlingua Ranch Road stated he had seen Mercer driving the silver SUV into the area almost once a month, usually in the late afternoon or early morning. Another resident recalled that he frequently showed up at mechanical supply stores near Lajitas, buying electrical wire, generator fuel, and small repair parts items that matched exactly what the investigative team recovered around the container. When the FBI obtained Mercer's DNA through an emergency search warrant, the comparison with samples collected from the container returned a perfect match. His DNA appeared in multiple locations inside the container, most notably on the generator handle, the drilled water jug strap, and the nylon restraint cord casing. This was not coincidence but physical proof that Mercer had direct contact with the restraint tools and the container's interior environment. Faint fingerprints found on the pried open door edge, though incomplete, also matched samples from Mercer's right thumb and index finger, as if to complete the terrifying picture. When investigators compared Beatrice's appearance with photographs of Mercer's mother from the 1987 CPS file, the team noted a striking facial similarity: high cheekbones, dark brown hair, slender build, and deep-set eyes. One investigator assessed that for someone carrying severe and prolonged trauma like Mercer, this physical resemblance could have been the triggering factor in selecting Beatrice as a victim, not randomly, but because she evoked the image of the woman who had caused all his childhood wounds. From all the accumulated evidence from DNA, Beatrice's testimony, tire tracks, the container crime scene, to his childhood abuse history, the FBI concluded that Mercer's motive boiled down to two elements: a deep-seated hatred of women rooted in childhood trauma, and the coincidental physical resemblance that made Beatrice a stand-in in his distorted mind. The fact that he not only imprisoned her but forced her to play the role of mother further proved this. In the compiled report, the investigative team wrote that Mercer was not merely an abductor, but an individual reenacting his own abused past by inflicting it on others. A warped psychological loop, meticulously prepared and sustained over many years, driven by an obsession that was never healed. The arrest warrant for Russell Mercer was issued immediately after the DNA match results and the evidence from the container crime scene were confirmed. Federal agents and Brewster County Sheriff's deputies swiftly deployed a mobile surveillance team to Alpine, where Mercer frequently stopped to buy generator-related parts and repair equipment. On the afternoon of June 19th, an employee at a mechanical supply store reported that Mercer had just appeared to ask about spark plugs, copper wire, and motor oil items that matched exactly the materials recovered at the holding site. As he stepped out of the store and opened the door of his silver Toyota 4Runner, officers approached simultaneously from both sides, ordering him to raise his hands and get down on his knees. Mercer did not flee, nor did he show any panic. He stared at them with the same cloudy, calm gaze Beatrice had described, before placing his hands behind his head and lying face down on the dusty pavement. The arrest was completed in under a minute. During the court-authorized search of the vehicle, officers found on the passenger seat a detailed map of Big Bend National Park, marked with numerous red symbols at trails well known in the female hiking community, such as Lost Mine Trail, South Rim, Grapevine Hills, and Window Trail. Several blue crosses noted recent dates, showing he had monitored and selected times when these trails were sparsely populated, especially midweek or ahead of bad weather days, periods when fewer visitors were present, just like the time Beatrice vanished. This note-taking behavior proved he was not acting randomly but had researched hiker patterns, planned carefully, and deliberately targeted victims. In the rear cargo area, police recovered a black nylon bag containing items that made anyone who saw them shudder: a coil of nylon rope, identical to the type used to bind Beatrice, an old electrical cord with worn rubber sheathing, matching the evidence found inside the container. and a small bottle of isoflurane anesthetic solution, a chemical that could be soaked into a cloth to induce unconsciousness in seconds, exactly as Beatrice described when she was attacked from behind at the trailhead. A thick gray cloth rag with a chemical odor was also recovered, and forensic examiners determined it was very likely the tool he used to temporarily incapacitate victims. These items, when laid out on the evidence table, formed a complete picture of his method of approach, neutralization, and transport of prey. While being handcuffed and placed into the patrol car, Mercer offered no resistance and showed no anger. He maintained a cold silence, eyes fixed straight ahead without glancing at anyone. During the initial interrogation, he answered none of the questions about Beatrice or the traces found in the container. But his silence was not denial. Instead, it carried a vague resignation, as though he viewed everything that happened as an inevitable consequence. When the interrogator read the list of seized items, he showed no surprise. One officer later recounted that there was only one moment when Mercer's expression changed when asked why he chose women who looked like his mother. He lifted his head, his cloudy eyes sinking under the light, then answered in a low, choked voice, as though speaking to himself, "They were like her. They deserved it." No remorse, no threat, just the grim certainty of someone who believed his actions were a form of correction for what had happened in his childhood. Those words were not a direct confession, but they were the clearest confirmation of the misogynistic motive that drove all his behavior. Investigators also compared Mercer's shoe size, a pair of size 11 redback work boots with their distinctive hexagonal sole pattern, and found they matched perfectly with the remaining footprints around the container, where the soil was compacted and imprinted with the characteristic hexagonal tread. Soil residue lodged in the sole grooves contained black basalt grains and red clay from Terlingua Ranch Road, further confirming he had been at the container site multiple times throughout the 2 years Beatrice was held. When a simultaneous search warrant was executed at Mercer's home in Marfa, investigators recovered additional evidence showing long-term preparation for his crimes. Numerous hand-drawn sketches of the container structure, lists of materials such as electrical wire, minifans, motor oil, along with notes on low traffic times at Big Bend campgrounds. Those notes were written neatly and meticulously to a chilling degree, showing his entire behavior was organized and carefully planned rather than impulsive or momentary. As Mercer was escorted out of the Alpine facility to be transferred to county jail, some residents standing along the road recognized him. The quiet, unassuming man who often bought fuel and parts, but none had imagined he carried such a dark obsession that he recreated his own childhood in the form of a holding site. A local mechanic who had known him whispered to police, "He always said generators are like people, you have to know where they got broken to keep them running." That remark, whether intentional or not, perfectly reflected how Mercer operated the hell he created. A system maintained by the hands of someone who had himself been broken by his mother's cruelty. The Behavioral Analysis Unit, BAU, spent many weeks reconstructing Russell Mercer's entire crime model by stringing together Beatrice's testimony, evidence from the container, items seized from his vehicle, and the decades-hidden childhood records. The analysis showed that Mercer did not select victims randomly but followed a very clear common pattern. Independent women who often hiked alone, confident in handling outdoor situations, and especially those who shared physical similarities with the mother who had abused him, from dark brown hair, sharp jawline, slender build, to determined eyes. In the mind of someone carrying severe psychological trauma, these resemblances didn't just remind him, they reactivated the entire fractured emotional structure from his childhood, turning the victim from an independent individual into a replacement version of the woman who had destroyed his early years. Investigators confirmed that Mercer never acted impulsively. He followed a calculated cycle: target selection, long-distance surveillance, habit research, then pinpointing the moment to remove the victim from the community and strike. Based on vehicle GPS data and traffic camera footage, the BAU concluded he surveilled victims for 2 to 4 days, a window long enough to memorize routes. Note when the victim typically separated from hiking groups, record habits of stopping for photos or water breaks, and especially identify times when the victim left the trailhead under low traffic conditions. The seized map collection in his vehicle contained numerous marked notations, showing he planned like a professional stalker, not like an impulsive abductor. When the timing was ripe, Mercer used a quick, silent incapacitation method, a form of attack classified by the BAU as typical of highly organized offenders. The bottle of isoflurane anesthetic solution and the thick cloth rag proved he chose minimal force approach, posing as friendly, asking for directions or help, then pressing the cloth over the victim's mouth the instant she bent down or turned away. Only a few seconds were needed to render her unconscious, without causing chaos or screams. This approach demonstrated he understood human physiology under brief suffocation and underscored his cold calculation. Once the victim was unconscious, Mercer immediately transported her to the partially buried container, a structure the BAU described as a deliberate restoration of the basement from his childhood. Every detail inside the container, from the low ceiling, cold metal walls, old mat, white noise fan, to light control, matched descriptions in the CPS records of how his mother had locked and punished him in the basement. This led the BAU to conclude that Mercer was not trying to create a secret environment to hide victims, but was deliberately recreating the environment that had traumatized him. With the roles reversed, he was now the one in control. The victim was the one at fault. This is a hallmark of untreated childhood trauma offenders, often classified as reenactment offenders, individuals who reenact painful memories in a way that grants them power. The BAU also examined the notebook found in the container, where Mercer had written fragmented phrases like, "She never listened," "Make her say it," "Same eyes, same voice," and "Punishment must match." Behavioral analysts concluded these entries were not crime planning notes, but part of a ritual he repeated to reinforce his new role in the recreated childhood script. This ritual included forcing the victim to kneel in the correct position, say the apology in the exact tone he demanded, and endure punishment with electrical cord, a weapon chosen not for injury efficiency, but because it was the very tool his mother had used to beat him in the past. This transformed Mercer's criminal behavior into ritualistic violence, structured, repetitive violence, with a clear psychological goal rather than impulsive aggression. According to the BAU, Mercer had no intention of killing his victims. On the contrary, he tried to keep them alive as long as possible to prolong the role he imposed. The mother he punished until she submitted. He needed the victim alive to repeatedly hear, "I'm sorry, son," because in his distorted mind, that was the one thing he had never received from his real mother. Depriving sleep with the fan noise, controlling water intake, forbidding the victim to stand when he entered, all served to demonstrate absolute power, thereby recreating the control a battered child never had. The BAU concluded that Mercer's behavior combined childhood trauma, trauma-linked obsessive-compulsive tendencies, and a drive to dominate victims as substitutes for his real mother. He did not choose victims to harm them as individuals, but because they filled the role of stand-ins for his past. This form of behavior rarely emerges unless childhood trauma was not only severe but prolonged, repetitive, and left untreated for many years. In the official report, the BAU wrote that Mercer did not abduct women, he abducted his own memories, and every victim served only as a means for him to complete a self-reenactment ritual aimed at proving that this time, he was the one who decided the outcome. As soon as the case file moved into the phase of building charges, the FBI laboratories simultaneously accelerated analysis of the evidence recovered from the container, from Russell Mercer's vehicle, and from the tattered clothing Beatrice was wearing when she was found. The results showed Mercer's DNA appearing in multiple key locations. The nylon restraint cord still bearing his skin cells, the drilled water jug strap with his sweat residue, and especially on the torn collar of Beatrice's shirt, an area investigators concluded could only have picked up DNA through direct contact during restraint. This DNA sample achieved a perfect match, eliminating any possibility of mix-up or coincidence. But what left the entire investigative team speechless was the analysis of the container interior. DNA from 2 other women was found on the mat, the restraint cord, and the metal wall edges. Neither sample matched any missing persons database at the time of initial analysis, proving that Mercer was a serial offender who had held and punished other women before targeting Beatrice. This was breakthrough evidence, shifting the case from a single abduction to a pattern of repeated, systematic criminal behavior. Meanwhile, the map recovered from the passenger seat in his vehicle continued to reinforce the argument of deliberate preparation. The map not only marked popular trails in Big Bend National Park, but included notes on ideal times to approach victims. Few people. Narrow path. No line of sight from parking lot. Solo hiker. Many points were flagged with red symbols that matched locations Beatrice had passed through on the day she disappeared, showing Mercer did not select targets randomly but actively hunted within the group of women who preferred independent camping. The precision of the markings also indicated he spent many hours observing and documenting, reinforcing his highly organized offender profile. Another crucial piece of physical evidence came from the bottle of anesthetic solution recovered in his vehicle. Forensic labs identified it as isoflurane, a chemical capable of rendering a victim unconscious within seconds if inhaled at high concentration. This was exactly the substance detected in residual traces in Beatrice's blood upon hospital admission, though the level had dropped significantly after many hours had passed. This match provided direct evidence linking Mercer to the abduction method, proving he possessed both the tools and the knowledge to incapacitate victims silently and without obvious injury. Terrain analysis around the container site also helped complete the full picture. Shallow tire impressions in the red clay soil were scanned with tread pattern matching algorithms and returned a 100% match with the BF Goodrich ATKO2 tires fitted on Mercer's Toyota 4Runner. Some impressions even showed the vehicle frequently stopping in the same position, enough to create deeper compacted zones consistent with his repeated visits to maintain the generator and resupply the container. In addition, footprints recovered at the scene, though largely erased by desert winds, still retained the distinctive hexagonal sole pattern of the work boots Mercer owned, further solidifying the direct connection between him and the holding location. Investigators also examined the possibility that Beatrice had voluntarily left the area, as some early theories had suggested accident or getting lost. However, the entire body of physical evidence completely refuted that direction. There were no signs she had ever left the trailhead under her own power. No personal items abandoned along a continuous path of travel, and especially no footprints of hers found departing the Grapevine Hills area on the day she vanished. The initial search teams had swept the entire 10-kilometer radius, but recorded no trace, consistent with her having been incapacitated and loaded into a vehicle just minutes after leaving the trailhead. All of this combined showed Beatrice could not have left the area on her own. There was no opportunity for her to walk to Terlingua Ranch Road, or the partially buried container. The only plausible explanation was that she was transported by motorized vehicle matching Mercer's SUV. When all the evidence was pieced together from DNA to the map, from tire tracks to the anesthetic chemical, a clear chain of facts emerged. Mercer surveilled, selected, incapacitated, and transported victims according to a distinct and repeatable pattern. No gap in the chain of evidence left room for doubt. Every element pointed to the same conclusion. Beatrice was abducted through organized, tool-assisted, premeditated action, with a clear motive. The full weight of the physical evidence not only built a complete case file against Mercer, but also closed off every avenue he might have used to deny responsibility, transforming Beatrice's horrific memories into the strongest foundation of the prosecution. In the most significant trial session since she was found, Beatrice Caldwell stepped onto the witness stand with a mixture of trembling and determination that everyone in the courtroom could feel. The 2 years of captivity had left marks not only on her body but etched deeply into every breath, every cautious glance. When the prosecutor asked her to recount everything that had happened, Beatrice gripped her hands so tightly that her knuckles turned white, but her voice, though not loud, was still clear enough for everyone in the room to hear every word. She began by describing how Russell Mercer approached her, and how he turned a partially buried container in the middle of the desert into his private prison. She spoke slowly, omitting no detail. The ice-cold metal walls, the low ceiling, the slanted floor, the smell of burning motor oil, the minifan's grating hum in the middle of the night, and the light spilling in from the door crack every time he entered. Many jurors leaned forward, as though unwilling to miss a single syllable of that weighty testimony. When the prosecutor asked about the punishment rituals, the ones behavioral experts had described as Mercer reenacting childhood trauma on another person's body, Beatrice's face immediately changed color. She took a deep breath, and for a few seconds it seemed as though the fear was pulling her back into the darkness of the container. Then she said, "He never looked at me as myself. He looked at me as her, his mother." The entire courtroom fell silent. She explained that before every meal, Mercer would stand at the container door, not fully entering but only sticking his head and half his body through the narrow gap, then command, "Say it." If she hesitated even a beat or said it wrong, he would slam hard against the wall, the sound reverberating through the space and plunging her into panic. I had to say, "I'm sorry, son." Every time, every day, many times, she whispered. If I cried, he hit me. If I stayed silent, he suffocated me. If I resisted, he used the electrical cord. The prosecutor allowed her a moment to pause, but Beatrice shook her head slightly, as though stopping would let even worse memories rise. When asked to describe what made her believe she was not the only one who had been held there, Beatrice briefly tightened her grip on the edge of the witness stand. She recounted that on many nights, when Mercer left the container and turned off the fan, the space became so still she could hear the sound of sand shifting, the faint creak of metal framing, and then once, the sound of a woman crying came from the left side. It wasn't an echo of me, she said. It was someone else. Very weak, but very clear. I heard her say, "Please." Then she went quiet. The prosecutor asked how many times she heard it. "More than once," Beatrice answered, eyes dropping as though the memory itself was another wound. Her mention of the crying caused the entire courtroom to tense because DNA from 2 other women had already been found inside the container. Her testimony, when cross-referenced with the evidence, was not only plausible, but the only living witness piece of a previously undetected cycle of crime. To bolster her account, the prosecutor asked her to recount the escape route, the detail that had once convinced investigators of the absolute reliability of her memory. Beatrice described how the sandstorm killed the generator, disabling the electronic lock. She remembered using the metal spoon she had sharpened under the mat to pry the container hinge, then forcing her emaciated body through the gap barely wide enough for a notebook. "The metal cut into my shoulders," she said, unconsciously touching the scar. "I thought I would get stuck, but I didn't stop." She described the moment she emerged outside the feel of iron-red soil under her hands, the thick clay smell in the air, and the eerie silence that told her she was very far from where she had disappeared. She said she followed the direction of the sun, avoiding the sharp rock areas to the south, following natural drainage washes toward FM 170. Every detail matched perfectly with the terrain analysis, forming living proof that she had truly broken out of the hell beneath the earth and endured over 30 hours of movement in near-death condition. In the courtroom, one juror had to pull out a tissue to wipe their eyes when Beatrice described crawling until I couldn't feel anything from the knees down. And when she saw the pickup truck of the 2 Terlingua residents, she tried to stand and wave, but her body simply collapsed, as though it had no bones left. The prosecutor asked, "Beatrice, what makes you believe what happened to you was not random?" Beatrice looked straight ahead, her gaze not directed at the prosecutor, nor at Mercer, who sat motionless behind bulletproof glass but into an invisible space where she perhaps still saw the darkness of the container. "He chose me, before I ever saw him," she said. "He knew I hiked alone. He knew I came from Austin. He followed me, and he took me because I looked like his mother." That statement sent a shiver through the entire courtroom. A defense attorney stood to object on emotional grounds, but the judge allowed the answer because it accurately reflected the content of her testimony and the criminal motive. At the end of her testimony, the prosecutor asked Beatrice to tell the court what she wanted them to understand more than anything else. She closed her eyes for a moment, as though gathering the last of her remaining strength, then lifted her head. Her voice was not loud, but each word rang like an undeniable moral verdict no one could ignore. I was not the only one. And in that instant, every whisper, every rustle of paper, every small movement in the room stopped, because everyone understood that her testimony was not only to convict Mercer, but to stand for the other women who never had the chance to walk out of that container the way she did. The trial of Russell Mercer opened in the thick, heavy silence of a packed courtroom, where every eye was fixed on the man who had turned the desert into a reenactment of his abused childhood by imprisoning and torturing women. The prosecutor took more than 2 hours just to present the massive chain of evidence collected throughout the investigation. Mercer's DNA on the binding ropes, on Beatrice's collar, on the generator and water tank, DNA from 2 other women inside the container, irrefutable proof that he was a repeat offender. The partially buried container reconstructed through photographs and 3D models, accurately recreating the structure where he held his victims. The notebook filled cover to cover with the words, "Mother, punishment, make her say it." The Big Bend map, marked with dozens of notations indicating trails where women often hiked alone. And finally, the consistent, chillingly detailed testimony of Beatrice Caldwell. All of it was strung together into a chain of logic so tight that the jury could find no gaps whatsoever. Each time the prosecution introduced a new piece of evidence, the courtroom shuddered not from the brutality itself, but from the ice-cold precision with which Mercer had planned everything from start to finish. Faced with that overwhelming mountain of proof, the defense attorney tried to build the only strategy still feasible, arguing that Mercer suffered from mental disorder, that his childhood abuse left him unable to appreciate the nature of his actions, that he lived in a reenactment delusion, and did not understand the legal consequences of what he was doing. They presented CPS records from 1987, reinterpreting every line to demonstrate severe trauma, even attempting to describe the container as a space of disordered self-expression rather than a deliberate place of confinement. However, each of their points was quickly dismantled by the prosecution, showing that Mercer had stalked victims for days, marked routes, purchased materials, concealed the container, maintained the generator, established consistent punishment rituals, and erased traces, acts that could only be carried out by someone fully aware of his purpose and its consequences. The question the prosecutor posed cut off the entire defense argument. How could a person who doesn't understand his own behavior keep women imprisoned for 2 years, repair locks, service the generator, drill holes to restrict drinking water, select targets, incapacitate them with chemicals, and conceal the holding site so meticulously? The defense attorney had no answer. Expert witnesses were called one after another. The behavioral analyst confirmed that Mercer fit the profile of an organized ritualistic offender, a calculated, patterned, repeat offender with full cognitive capacity. She described the container as a deliberate reconstruction of his childhood basement, a structure he recreated to reverse the roles, from the locked-up child to the one doing the locking. The forensic pathologist presented conclusions from Beatrice's injuries. Multiple layers of ligature marks on the wrists, indicating prolonged restraint. Ribs healed in misalignment consistent with being struck with a cord-like object. Severe vitamin D deficiency, and soft tissue atrophy from lack of light. Extreme dehydration. Anesthetic chemical traces in the blood-matching equipment found in Mercer's vehicle. All of it proved Beatrice never left the trailhead on her own. She was abducted by rapid incapacitation, held long-term under extremely harsh conditions, and had no realistic chance of self-rescue, absent the sandstorm that killed the generator. When the expert testimony concluded, the judge requested a final assessment of Mercer's mental competency. The forensic psychology report delivered a definitive conclusion. Although Mercer carried severe childhood trauma, he was fully competent and in control of his actions at the time of the offenses. He knew exactly what he was doing, why he was doing it, and had planned the concealment systematically. This was not an outburst, not delusion, but a logical, repeating, ongoing, and escalating pattern of criminal behavior. The court also noted an FBI report indicating a strong possibility of additional victims beyond the 2 unidentified DNA samples, who may have been brought into the container or a similar structure in the Terlingua Ranch area, a possibility that made the courtroom air heavier than ever. National media followed the trial daily, news channels running constant tickers describing Mercer as the man who recreated his childhood hell on the bodies of women, and one of the most terrifying long-term captivity cases in modern Texas history. Legal analysts appearing on television stated that the level of preparation, the ritualistic nature, and the likelihood of other missing victims pushed the case far beyond local scope, turning it into a textbook example, now included in criminology curricula. And at the center of it all, while prosecutors, expert witnesses, reporters, and jurors all focused on Mercer, Beatrice Caldwell sat in silence, hands still clasped tightly together, carrying within her the truth she first spoke when she was found. The haunting realization that it was not only what he had done to her, but what he may have done to others, those who never came back to tell their stories the way she did. The sentence for Russell Mercer was handed down on the windless afternoon of the third day of trial, when all the evidence, testimony, and behavioral analysis had been fully presented to the jury and the federal judge. The courtroom was so still that hardly anyone breathed hard as the judge slowly read aloud the list of charges on which Mercer was found guilty. First-degree kidnapping with the aggravating factor of confinement lasting more than 24 months. Aggravated assault for repeated acts of violence using dangerous instruments. Attempted murder because the conditions of confinement, starvation, and deprivation of drinking water were sufficient to cause death, and unlawful imprisonment, with clear evidence established through the partially buried container. When all the sentencing ranges were added together, the judge pronounced a total federal prison term of 132 years, with no parole, no sentence reduction, and no eligibility for early release. The judge's final words, "You will spend the rest of your life in the very place you once created for others," caused the courtroom to sink into a heavy, oppressive silence. In the row to the right, Beatrice's family broke into tears upon hearing the number 132 years, not out of joy, but because it was the final legal confirmation that what she had endured now had a name in the law, someone held accountable, and a sentence heavy enough to bring justice as close as possible in a case where nothing could ever fully make it right. Her mother held Beatrice tightly, while her younger brother, the one who received her last text message at 5:41 p.m. 2 years earlier, bowed his head, shoulders shaking with a mixture of relief and pain. The prosecution stood immediately after the sentencing to inform the court that the investigation was not over. The DNA from the two unidentified women in the container would continue to be pursued, and the federal investigative team would expand the search area around Terlingua Ranch to determine whether any other holding sites existed. That announcement plunged the courtroom into another wave of silence, because it confirmed that Beatrice's words, "I wasn't the only one," were not just a warning, but a grave truth that demanded further investigation. When Mercer was asked if he wished to speak before the court, a required procedure before closing the sentencing hearing, he stood up, hands cuffed but back straight, showing no fear or hesitation. He glanced briefly at Beatrice's family, then turned to the judge and let fall a few words as cold as metal hitting the floor. She deserved it. No one could tell whether in that statement she referred to his mother, to Beatrice, or to both, merged into the same image that had run unbroken through his mind. But those words, no remorse, no admission of guilt, no plea for mercy, once again demonstrated that Mercer had never seen himself as a criminal. He was simply continuing a sequence of actions he believed constituted justice. As he was led out of the courtroom, a few people gripped each other's hands tightly, as if to hold on to the feeling that at least the greatest danger had been removed from society. Mercer's sentence immediately triggered a powerful reaction in the community, especially among groups of women who regularly hike alone. Outdoor forums, social media, and national news outlets began discussing safety when exploring remote wilderness areas like Big Bend, where the quiet and isolation that make it appealing are also the very vulnerabilities that predators can exploit. Many people shared their own stories of times they felt followed on the trail, of unfamiliar vehicles parked nearby, or of unsettling stares. A large wave of calls arose for more security cameras at trailheads, better early missing person protocols, and self-defense training for solo hikers. The Mercer case became the focal point for a series of investigative specials, analyses of organized crime in wilderness settings, and the risks of being stalked that many women do not realize they face. In Big Bend, new warning signs were erected, advising visitors to clearly document their itineraries, share their locations with family, and report any suspicious vehicles or individuals immediately. While the 132-year sentence closed the legal chapter for Mercer, The case opened a national conversation about safety, about the responsibility to protect vulnerable people, and about the truth that even in the most beautiful places, nature is not the only threat. Sometimes it is people themselves who are the hidden danger beneath the desert silence. After Mercer was sentenced and the case closed on the legal level, Beatrice Caldwell's life entered an entirely new phase one, without the container, without the ropes, without the shadow of the man standing outside the door waiting for her to repeat the haunting phrase, but also not the peaceful phase many wished for her. Physical recovery happened slowly but measurably. Her body regained weight, her ribs healed in proper alignment after months of physical therapy, and the feet that had been torn apart during 30 hours of stumbling through the desert gradually regained sensation. But no doctor could measure the depth of the other wounds, those not in her lungs, bones, or muscles, but in the regions of memory that made her bolt upright in the middle of the night, in a state of suffocating panic. PTSD clung to her like a shadow. Every time the lights went out or she heard the sound of a running machine, whether it was just an air conditioner or a vacuum cleaner, she would instantly hold her breath, feeling her chest tighten the same way it had when she was locked in the container. The psychologist said those reactions would lessen over time, but would never disappear completely. She avoided touching cold metal unless absolutely necessary, never stood alone in a dark room, and always checked the locks twice whenever entering an enclosed space. But amid those cracks, something else rose within her willpower. After the trial, Beatrice decided not to let her story sink into the darkness the way the silence Mercer once imposed on her had. She founded a foundation to support women who travel independently, especially those who love hiking or solo camping. The foundation funds personal locator devices, self-defense classes, awareness programs at universities, and safety guide materials for women who frequently move alone. She also partnered with nonprofit organizations to push Western states to adopt early missing person notification systems for hikers, a program that uses data from trailheads and traffic cameras to detect anomalies within just a few hours, rather than the many days it took when she went missing. Every time she appeared in public, Beatrice still carried that familiar guarded posture, her voice low but clear, and her eyes never lingering too long in any dark corner of the room. But every word she spoke carried the determination of someone who refused to let silence become an ally of the criminal. At Big Bend, her case led to sweeping changes. Rangers implemented new trail monitoring programs with sensors, increased patrols in less traveled areas, and especially launched a voluntary location tracking service for solo hikers. A system that sends a position ping every 15 minutes, with data fed directly to a coordination center, and triggering an alert if the user remains stationary for an unusually long period. Information stations erected new warning signs requiring visitors to report detailed itineraries, expected return times, and emergency contacts before entering trails. Many longtime rangers admitted they had never imagined a vast area like Big Bend could conceal a partially buried container for 2 years without anyone noticing. That realization forced the entire monitoring system to re-examine the safety limits they once thought sufficient. Even though the case had ended, Beatrice continued to insist in interviews that the desert still held many secrets people had not yet uncovered. She believed the DNA samples from the 2 unidentified women were only the tip of a larger truth. "The desert is bigger than we think," she said. "And he didn't do it only to me." Her words were not speculation, but the recollection of someone who had once heard faint cries through a metal wall, who had once sensed the presence of others in the unseen darkness. She repeated many times that there were still places in the desert mounds of earth, rarely traveled stretches, deep dry washes that might be hiding the stories of victims who never returned. Society responded to that warning with a mixture of concern and awakening. Outdoor forums opened long discussions about the hiking community's responsibility. Many people began sharing their itineraries more openly, practicing survival skills, and learning to read signs of danger. Women who once confidently hiked alone now carried personal alarms, shared locations continuously, and traveled only during daylight hours. Those changes did not come from pure fear, but from the understanding that the freedom to explore nature cannot be separated from awareness of human threats. And at the center of that change, Beatrice, with eyes that had seen the deepest darkness of the desert, became the one reminding the world that safety is never a given. Her story did not end when the container was unearthed, when Mercer was arrested, or when the court handed down the sentence. It lives on in every warning, in every solo step taken by those who walk alone, and in the new vigilance that Big Bend and the rest of America were forced to learn. The desert holds not only beauty, but sometimes stories that light takes a very long time to reach. Beatrice Caldwell's story is not just a personal tragedy, but a profound reminder for life in the United States today. A vast country where the freedom to explore nature is seen as part of cultural identity, but also a place where the gaps between people and the wilderness are sometimes exploited by the wicked. The fact that Beatrice vanished right on one of Big Bend's most famous trails shows that risk lies not only in terrain or weather, but also in individuals like Russell Mercer, someone with plans, tools, knowledge of the landscape, and the ability to hide criminal behavior from the community. The detail that she was attacked simply for bending down to look at a map reveals the fragility of everyday moments, while the partially buried container in the desert reminds us that evil sometimes exists right where no one imagines. Beatrice's extraordinary survival, from using a metal spoon to escape the container, to stumbling for 30 hours across the desert, sends a powerful message. Preparing survival skills and safety gear is never excessive. Big Bend's overhaul of trail monitoring procedures and provision of location tracking services for solo hikers also reflects the reality that outdated safety systems no longer fit the modern context where criminals quickly adapt. Technological gaps. The biggest lesson that can be drawn for Americans today is this: freedom and safety must go hand in hand. If you enjoy hiking alone, share your itinerary, carry a locator device, learn how to handle emergencies, and pay attention to small details like unfamiliar vehicles parked near trailheads or someone following behind. At the same time, Beatrice's story calls on society to invest more in community mental health support, because as the Mercer case shows, untreated childhood trauma can turn into a danger for all of society. She survived to tell the tale, and that telling is a warning America cannot ignore. If Beatrice's survival story has made you feel the need to pay more attention to personal and community safety, please hit subscribe to join us on the next journeys ahead. Thank you for following, and see you in the next video where we continue to unpack truths that cannot be forgotten.